Good morning, Karen. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your research on abuse in institutional settings.
Sure. My primary area of research interest is in sexual offending and victimization, and in 2002 I became interested in child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in the United States. And at that time, some researchers at John Jay College were commissioned to conduct 2 studies on abuse in the church. And we conducted studies on the nature and scope of the problem and the causes and context of the problem. And we came up with a number of interesting findings that explained information about the extent of abuse in the church from 1950 to 2002. We understood information about the abusers, the victims, and the situations in which the abuse occurred. And I studied abuse in the Catholic Church for about a decade, and at that point I began to expand my area of research interest to other institutions. And I was interested in understanding if there were similarities in other types of institutions in child sexual abuse, and the types of abuse and abusers, and the responses of the organizations to abuse. So at this point in time, I'm also looking at abuse within the Boy Scouts from all publicly released files from court actions. And we are currently conducting analyses to determine some of the causes and context of abuse in that organization as well.
Would you be able to tell us what you think some of the key findings are that has come out of the research that you've been conducting over the last decade or so, and some of those important issues you think that have come out of the work you've done thus far?
Mm-hmm. I think that what we've seen in all of the organizations that we've looked at is that there are certain micro-level factors and macro-level factors that really can help to explain how child sexual abuse was able to occur and proliferate in these institutions. And so we've looked at factors related to the causes of offending, and looked at individual offenders and who was joining the organizations. And what we found is that there's not really a lot of individual factors that can differentiate these offenders prior to the time that they commit the acts of abuse. We've looked a lot at the situational factors and the situations in which the abuse occurred, the opportunities that the offenders had to commit the abuse. We found that there are a number of institutional factors that have allowed abuse to occur because they presented opportunities for offenders. And then we've also discovered that there are certain cultural factors that have allowed the abuse to proliferate. So the power dynamics within the institutions and the power that the abusers had over the individuals that they targeted to abuse. Also, we've looked at kind of the culture that prohibited or kept individuals from reporting abuse, and then the institutional response to abuse, which often was done through these internal mechanisms within the organizations as opposed to reporting some of the abuse to civil authorities. And so these are factors that we found that are consistent within various types of institutions.
Thanks for that, Karen. I was wondering if you could talk about what you think some of the unresolved issues are in the research and what needs to be addressed and why.
Well, in terms of the research that I'm doing, one of the difficulties is really assessing some of these child protection policies that have been put in place. And there are a number of reasons why it's difficult to do that. One reason is because there is a decline in the amount of child sexual abuse in the US and globally from the time that these child protection policies were put in place. It makes it very difficult to assess the efficacy of the policies that have been implemented. And what you really need to do is understand whether there's been a cultural shift within these institutions to understand whether or not these are going to be effective at really changing the culture and ensuring that people will report abuse that takes place, in addition to preventing abuse from taking place to begin with.
Terrific. And finally, I was just wondering what research you're currently working on at the moment, whether you have any collaborations moving forward and the kind of questions that you'll be addressing in that research.
Certainly. I've just begun working on a couple of new projects. For one project, I'm working with scholars at Griffith University on the prosecution project, and I'm working with Mark Finane and Yorick Small in particular, and we are looking at priests from a variety of religious institutions who've had allegations of abuse and who have been prosecuted, and we're looking at differences amongst different types of religious personnel who have been prosecuted and the situations of their abuse and how what the responses are of the criminal justice system. and additionally looking at a comparison between those religious personnel who have been prosecuted and non-religious personnel. I am also working with York Small on a collaborative project looking at pedophile networks and really the social networks of pedophile groups prior to the internet, and looking at who are members of these networks and how they formed and the type of material that they were distributing and who the members were. And we're really beginning to get a sense of kind of the global networks that did exist prior to the internet.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Karen.
Thank you.